First thing we always ask is your name, when you were born, and where you were born.
Okay, I was born in a little town in Kentucky called Central City. Um, my dad was a wholesale beer distributor. Um, I was born in 1924, November 9th. Moved to California in 1942 because my dad's beer business was voted out by the county voters. So he retired. So we again moved to California, and I immediately registered at Loyola University and almost finished my first year when, well, long story, but a friend of mine um, wanted to join the Air Corps, and he didn't have a car, so I did. I drove him over to March Field so he could take the tests. On the way over there, he talked me into uh, uh, taking the test also. I had already decided to join the Marine Corps as soon as the school year was over, my freshman year. But anyway, he said, while you're there, why don't you? And so I did. Well, at the end of the day in March Field there in Riverside, California, probably 200 of us in the room, uh, they started calling out the names of those who had passed the test. Now, the tests were extensive. You wouldn't believe. I mean, every kind of test you can think of. In addition to physical, there was psychological and psychomotors and just, of course, eyeball tests up to here. Um, anyway, they called my name. They did not call Jeffrey's name. On the way home in my car, I'm driving along, patting him on the shoulder. He's crying, literally crying. Um, and I'm, again, patting him on the shoulder and thinking to myself, what am I going to tell my mom? Okay. So that's how I got into the aviation cadets. It was ironic. A few days later, in the same mail one day, I got two letters. One from the Army Air Corps commanding me to appear for basic training in a little town in Utah, an Army base, take infantry training. The other letter I got that same day was from the draft board saying, greetings. So I went down and said, hey, it's too late. You guys didn't get me. I've already joined the Air Corps. Well, they said, that's fine as far as we're concerned, but hope we can catch it. We've already sent it in. Well, as it turned out, they couldn't stop it, so I ended up with a draftee serial number. Now, draftee serial numbers started with a 3. That meant draftee. You had to be a volunteer to get into the cadet program, and for some reason they did let me in, but the volunteer serial numbers all started with a 1. Well, obviously, I stuck out in every roster that ever was, that draftee serial number. I caught holy heck from every second lieutenant, every corporal, well, everybody that outranked me, and that was everybody in the military. I answered your question.
That's really something. So where'd you go then? What kind of training did you really wind up with then?
Well, okay, after the basic training and infantry training, really, firearms and running and so forth, gas mask drills and all that, we were sent to different colleges around the country. Well, when I got to the college in Montana, Missoula, they found out I already had a year of college, so they shipped me immediately out to the classification center in Santa Ana, California. That's where they took all the applicants and divided them into 3 groups. Candidates to be bombardiers, candidates to be navigators, candidates to be pilots. The course, the kids that were selected to be navigators all said it's because they were the smarter ones in the group. Of course, the bombardiers said no, they picked us because of our manual dexterity, our aptitude for math, and so forth. And the leftovers were sent to pilot school. That was me. I was one of the leftovers.
You kind of touched your mic there as you worked around your collar there, so we do kind of hear that when you.
Yeah, so if you can avoid.
Just try to avoid touching your collar.
It's fine using your hands, but.
Okay. Yeah.
The hand, I don't mind the hand motions, that's
No,
great.
that's great.
Not around the collar.
So the leftovers there.
Okay, so I'm one of the leftovers. So I was sent to pilot school, again in California, a little town called Visalia. We had Ryan primary trainers, single wing, low wing. They had an airspeed of about 115, which was about 2 miles faster than their stalling speed. It was a real challenge to fly those things, but they were a lot of fun. Open cockpit, you really felt like an aviator when you were flying one of those things. Just one little sidelight about primary in Visalia. In our barracks building, there were 80 cadets. Of course, we had to have a pool to see who would solo first. We all put $5 in the pool. $400. In those days, we were paid $55 a month. That included the extra 50% because we were flyers. Anyway, one day, and it was a civilian flying school. So the instructors were civilians, and all the personnel there were civilians except for the check pilots. They were first lieutenants. One day, when we landed from one of our practice with the instructor pilot, he climbed out of the back seat, stood on the wing, leaned in the cockpit and said, "Do you think you can take it around?" Well, now the contract called for 8 hours of dual instruction. I had 8 hours and 5 minutes. Anyway, he leaning in the cockpit, he could see my knees moving. They were literally shaking. It was scary, almost as scary as this. I was thinking of that $400. So, taxiing up right next to me, my friend named Clutterham. Now everything in cadets was alphabetical. My name is Clarke, C-L-A-R. Clutterham was C-L-U-T, was in the top bunk. We were bunkmates. Anyway, he came taxiing up. His instructor got out, was leaning it, probably saying the same thing to him that mine was saying to me, Well, I wish all of a sudden I'm not as nervous anymore. I'm anxious. I want to get off the ground. Well, finally, my instructor jumped off the wing, and I taxied over the end of the runway, checking the mags on the roll, which was strictly forbidden. Anyway, I was the first one off the ground. Now, it happened that a lot of the cadets on their first solo would not land the first time around. They'd go around the pattern and get scared and make another run. And I landed on the first pass. And I won the $400. Wow. How many months' pay was that? $55 a month, 7.5 months worth of money. Anyway, after 65 hours at primary, we were sent to Bakersfield for what they call basic flying. And these are very military-looking airplanes, BT-13s they were called, all metal. They had flaps, they had 2-speed props, they had radios, all these things that we didn't have in primary. We did a lot of formation flying, navigation, night flying, shooting night landings at auxiliary fields and so forth. So another 65 hours there. Then they asked us at the end of that 65 hours what we wanted to fly in the Air Corps. Well, I had fallen in love with a airplane called the B-26 Martin Marauder. It was, I think, the best looking airplane coming out of World War II. had very small wings for such a big two-engine airplane, though. In fact, it was called the Flying Prostitute. No visible means of support, right? Anyway, because of that, I was sent to a multi-engine advanced flying school down in Texas, Pecos, Texas. The air base was bigger than the town. And it was way the heck out in the desert part of western Texas, a long way from anything except oil wells. And, we graduated from there after our third set of 65 hours. And just backing up for a second, going through cadets was purposefully made as stressful as possible. I think it was designed that way. For example, the lieutenants used to say to us, now look at the man on your right, now look at the man on your left. When you get finished with this school, one of you will not be here, or two of you, or whatever. You know, the washout rate was fabulous. In fact, I don't remember the exact numbers, but we were told at classification before we were sent to our first flying school that 1 out of 22 of us would make it with some kind of wings. I mean, bombardier, navigator, pilot. And 6 out of 8 of us would be commissioned. The rest of them would get warrants. So your odds of ending up with silver wings and gold bars was something like 1 in 30, 35, something like that. So the odds were not very good. And you look around at your fellow cadets, and it's intimidating. These are the cream of the crop. I mean, these guys with the perfect eyeballs, good-looking guys, all of them, physical specimens, and these are the guys I got to compete with. And out of 40 of us, 39 won't be here at the end of the program. That was aviation cadet. I made it. Wow. Graduated down in Texas and became a brand new second lieutenant. One other sidelight real quickly, I was sent home, of course, for a couple of weeks leave then at the after graduation. I went to my home in Redlands, California, a little town near San Bernardino, and borrowed my dad's car and went over to visit him. Now, he was a guard at a defense plant in San Bernardino. My dad had made some money in the beer business, but everybody worked for the war effort in World War II, everybody, regardless of their financial status. So anyway, this is a scene I will never, ever forget, and that's driving up to that front gate. He was a guard. He had to salute officers. I come driving up, and my dad salutes. Brand new second lieutenant. That, I think, is one of the highlights of my life. My own dad saluting me. Of course, I drove on through and parked and came running back, you know. Glad to see my dad. Well, they kept me in Pecos then for about a month, waiting for an opening at the B-26 school. There was only one of those in the country down in Del Rio, Texas. Well, after a month of being around there, there's still no opening. They gave up on me and sent me up to Lincoln, Nebraska, where crews were formed for the big bombers. Now, in that time, the big bombers were the B-17s and the B-24s. In fact, the headquarters building had a sign on the door that said VHBs, very heavy bombers, right? Of course, you could put those things in the Bombays now of airplanes that we have in this time frame. So I was assigned to a crew as co-pilot. My pilot was a prince among men, a man I think so respectfully of, looking back on it now, 60 years ago. A big red-headed guy from North Carolina. Wyatt Stewart Jones. That was his actual name. He was named for Wyatt Earp and Jeb Stewart. And that crew that I was assigned to was a motley crew in so many respects. Books could be written about them. Just a couple of quick examples. Our tail gunner, a guy named Carruthers, was released from prison to get into the military. Now, they did that in World War II, and I'm sure you've heard about that. I don't think they let serial killers out, but almost everybody else. Carruthers had been a bank robber. Turned out he was a good guy to have on the crew. If you needed something, he'd steal it for you, you know. So it worked out. One of our waist gunners, a guy named Carruthers. Now we're in the military, and this is years before people wore their hair, men wore their hair long. Carruthers would comb his hair forward, put on his helmet, and then comb it back over his helmet. I'm not kidding. Oh well, like I said, they were a motley crew in so many ways. Our navigator was a genius, literally. You know, they used to kid us about picking the bright ones to be navigators. Well, he was very bright. But he had all the earmarks of a genius. His socks didn't match, and he didn't care. He was just a good guy. He saved our lives several times. And he was good enough that he got us promoted to a lead crew just because of our navigator. Our bombardier was very good also. We went from there as a crew to Rapid City, South Dakota for crew training. We would assemble our B-17s over Mount Rushmore, and we'd go and bomb in formation. We'd go and bomb Omaha or Kansas City or other Midwestern cities, fly over, open the bomb bay doors, and take pictures. So that's the way we practiced bombing in the United States. So then after being there a couple of months and doing that, and we were now combat ready, we went back to Lincoln, Nebraska for shipment then overseas. We were issued a brand new B-17, beautiful airplane, a B-17G, which was the latest one, with modern things. And if you're a flyer, you know about the turbos. They were all in one dial on the G. On the Fs, you had stick turbos, one for each engine. Plus you had your RPM control for each engine, another stick. Plus your throttle, which was another stick. So you had 12 sticks to operate on that 4-engine bomber on the Fs. Now the G had all the turbos into one dial, so it simplified it somewhat. Somebody told us that you couldn't buy good whiskey in England. So Jones got the bright idea, hey, let's take some with us. So we took up a collection among the crew and we bought a case of Canadian Club. Now in those days, whiskey came in quarts, not fifths. Now, Canadian Club. So we take it out. Now we were also told that our airplanes would be examined and so forth several times during our flight overseas and after we arrived in England. So we hid these things. I personally took one of those bottles of Canadian Club, got up behind the number 3 engine, stuffed it back there by the fuel cell of the fuel tank, wrapped in an old T-shirt. But anyway, all 12 bottles are on there someplace. And we left one night, in the middle of the night, in our brand new B-17 from Lincoln, Nebraska. Now security was fabulous, just outstanding. That afternoon, I had gone to the barber. I'm getting a haircut, and the barber says, I hear you guys are leaving tonight. so fantastic security, huh? Our first stop was in New Hampshire. I got to say some kind words about New Hampshire. Little town, Grenier Field was the base. They had a perpetual party going on for combat crews going through there. Live music, I mean full orchestra. Um, all the local girls were there to dance with and so forth. It was fantastic. About the middle of the evening, I left. I was going to go out and relieve one of our guys that was guarding the airplane. And as I went out, they handed me a paper sack, a brown paper bag. After I got outside, I opened it up, and in there was candy bars, sewing kits, nail clippers, all kinds of little goodies for an American going off to war. It was just the warmest feeling. These people, again, kind thoughts about New Hampshire. I had never been there before. Our first stop after leaving New Hampshire was Labrador. And in Labrador, we were briefed on our next stop, which was Greenland. Now, the air base in Greenland, and they had a movie about it, a training film. The air base at Greenland runway came up out of the end of a fjord. So imagine flying down a fjord, these narrow canyon walls on both sides of you over the water, to land on this strip that came up literally out of the water on an uphill slant. But just to complicate matters, there was a Sugarloaf Mountain, a rock formation sticking up out of the water just before you get to the end of that. So to land on that thing, your wheels down, flaps down, you're making your final approach. Just before you get to the end of the runway, you have to dart around this rock formation, line up immediately and touch down. That was the whole plan. They lost some airplanes trying to do that. So anyway, we flew to Greenland. We couldn't land. The place was socked in. I mean, truly socked in, very heavy fog. Well, so what do? Well, we were instructed by the tower there to proceed to Iceland. Well, we didn't have fuel to go to Iceland. And Iceland, well, Labrador, back behind us, was even farther than Iceland. So now what do? Proceed. Now the water down there is 15 degrees. I mean, there's icebergs floating around, you know, okay. I mentioned a minute ago that our navigator, Blozinski was his name. He was the only Yankee on the crew. Everybody on it was Southern boys except Blow. He's up there in the Astrodome taking fixes, the sun and the stars, whatever, and calling us with 1 degree corrections. Now, who ever heard of a 1 degree correction? Of course, we were on autopilot because it's more accurate than manual. We had lowest RPMs we could and manifold pressure. We had 15 degrees flaps. We were doing everything we could to conserve fuel. Well, we just knew we couldn't make it. Well, now, it was partly our fault. Before we got to Greenland, Jones and I got in a big argument about that thing we saw down there on the water. We were like 10, 11,000 feet. And he said it was an aircraft carrier, and I said, oh, no. We don't have aircraft carriers in this part of the war. Anyway, no, it's an iceberg. No, it's an aircraft. We got arguing back. So he wheeled the thing over, and down we go. And hey, I was right. It was an iceberg. He flew across the thing, and we climbed back up. That took a lot of fuel. So anyway, now we're on our way to Iceland, and knowing darn well we can't make it. And again, Blow is doing a fabulous job of navigating. We made it, obviously. All of our fuel gauges were pegged. I mean, and Blazinski. While I'm on the subject of him, I just got to spend one more minute with him. As I said a minute ago, he was a genius. The guy lacked common sense, but he was a genius in so many ways. On our first mission, we're flying over this big city. One of the gunners called Blazinski. He says, by the way, we all call each other by our first names or by a nickname. There was no cleavage between officers and enlisted people. Blow, he says, what is that city down there? Blow said, I'll call you back. Now, he always said, I'll call you back. I don't care what you ask him. I'll call you back. So pretty soon he calls back. That's Brussels, he said. So another one of the gunners says, well, what country is that in? I'll call you back. So help me. That's what he did. That was Blow. Yeah. So anyway, we get to Iceland, and just a quick sidelight about Iceland. Am I taking too long, Phil? Okay. We were there 10 days, and the reason we were there so long is because the wind was blowing fiercely. A horrible storm, and it just went on and on and on. In fact, when we landed, they brought out these trucks, these army trucks, these 6x they call them, put one on either side of us and tied ropes to them and to our our landing gear struts, just to keep it from tipping over. So anyway, about the 7th day, here we've been sitting in this Quonset hut. It's 4 degrees outside. And what do? You sit there and you look at the fire and the little potbelly, and that's it. So after about a week, Jones says, hey, we're only 3 or 4 miles out of Reykjavik. Let's go see the town. You crazy? It's 4 degrees. Oh, come on. He and his crazy idea. So anyway, we put on everything we owned, and here we go. So we're walking out there, and it's 4 degrees. I was so cold, I couldn't talk. My lips wouldn't operate. It was just, anyway. We're on the outskirts of town, just coming into some buildings and so forth, when here comes a Jeep. Turned out to be an MP Jeep. It had these side curtains on it, you know. One of the MPs leaned out and says, are you people on combat crews? Yes. You know you're not allowed off the base? Get in. Thank God, he saved our lives. So we're taken back to the base. Well, anyway, we left Iceland and we went then to a town called Chorley, 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 England. That was our last stop, and our last view of that beautiful new B-17. So we better quickly retrieve our Canadian club, right? So we're out there. No, these guys, they had taken off inspection plates, you know, and stuffed it up in there. You know. So it turned out that, and mine, I reached up behind the number 3 to get the thing and came back with a handful of glass. I mean, well, think about it. How many times that had frozen and how many times it had boiled, you know, right behind the engine. Anyway, out of 12 bottles, we retrieved 1, just 1. So here we are in this big room at Chorley. Our B4 bags are out in the middle. I'll never forget this scene, in a mound out there in the middle, and we're sitting around the room. And so 1 bottle of it. So Jones is sitting here. So he opens the bottle. He's first because he's the pilot. He takes a big glug and hands it to that guy, and it goes that way. And by the time it got to me, it was empty. I didn't even get a swig of it. I don't care for bourbon anyway, but anyway.
How can you be from Kentucky and not care for bourbon?
Okay. All right. So finally we get to our base in Mendlesham, England, in East Anglia, about 14 miles out of Ipswich, the 34th Bomb Group, B-17s. The big truck came up to this Quonset hut, and we all jumped out of the back of it with our bags and so forth. A couple of MPs were there and they wouldn't let us go in. They said, we're still clearing out the things from the crew that stayed there last night. They were shot down this morning. So that was our introduction to the war. After they cleared out these guys' belongings, then we moved in. So we're there the following night. About 4 days later, we see our name on the bulletin board, Jones' name on they had the formation in picture, or in graphics anyway, with the names of the pilots on them, so you can see where your position was. Now, we got no additional training, no introduction, no guided tours, none of that. It's just, okay, we fly tomorrow. On that first mission, we take off and we're just climbing over the end of the runway when this bright glow in our cockpit and all around our airplane, like flames, like fire. We didn't know it then. We found out that night when we got home. But sure enough, one of the airplanes that had taken off ahead of us didn't make it. He crashed on the end of the runway, and it was burning, and it was his flames that we were flying through on our climb out on our way. Let me stop at this point before I get into combat and tell you what I think are a couple of human interest stories, if I may, and stop me if I get too long, Phil. On one of our missions, our number 3 engine burst into flames. Now, we were up at about 18 or 19,000 feet, still over England. We were forming up the squadron. The way they used to do that, they had a beacon that shot straight up. We called it a buncher. The airplanes would fly to it and circle the buncher until the squadron was all formed. And then it would fly on to another buncher where the other squadrons were coming in and forming the bomber stream. It was all very precision. It was amazing the way they did that. Anyway, we were just approaching the buncher when our number 3 engine burst into flames. And it didn't just start smoldering or flickering or anything, it burst into flames. Well, you know, right behind those engines are those wings full of gas. And we had just taken off, so we had a full bomb load, a full gas load, and flames going over the gas load. So you got to get out of there quickly. Well, I did everything wrong. They trained us so well. We got out in a fairly orderly manner. We were supposed to go out the nose hatch, and if you've seen the Gregory Peck 12 o'clock high, you know the nose hatch where he's climbing up in there. Well, now they trained us to hold our ankles and roll out like a ball because you want to minimize the wind catching you, because back there, halfway back on the airplane, is the ball turret with a couple of big 50 caliber machine guns sticking down. You don't want to hit those things at 160 knots, you know. Anyway, I go in like going into a cold swimming pool, you know, like one toe at a time. For some miraculous reason, I did not hit those guns. I missed them, thank heaven, or I wouldn't be here now. Well, I did several other foolish things on that bailout. It was the only time I ever bailed out. They had trained us, of course, that on our parachutes, we wore the harness all the time. The parachute had buckles on it. They would snap on that harness, and it was called a chest pack. And then when we deployed it, of course, it would burst open right in your face. So they trained us to put your hand in front of your face when you snap that parachute. I didn't, and I got hit in the face, and I have the scar to prove it. I bit right through my lip. Wham! I catch myself singing as loud as I can. Amor, amor, amor. That was a song popular in World War II. And Oh, and I tried to light cigarettes. I used up a whole box of matches. I mean, geez, the wind, you know, 600 feet a minute going by. Of course, I didn't light this silly. I finally threw it away and the matches and everything. Landed in the lady's front yard, and landed all wrong too. They trained us how to, you know, steer those chutes a little bit. You could stop oscillations and so forth if you did it right. You know, I didn't do it right. Anyway, I landed on a backswing, so my heels, and then I sat down real hard, and then I banged my head. Now, fortunately, it was in her front yard, in her flower bed, and the earth was sort of soft. You know, from, I guess, tilling around the flowers. Huh? So I'm dazed, but I'm looking up, and here's all these flowers, and this white silk parachute over me. You know, I thought I was in heaven. I truly did. You know, it's so beautiful. But anyway, here's these people standing around. And this lady is standing there crying. Well, I stood up, and that hurt. And I remember saying to the lady, "Don't cry, don't cry. The Air Corps will buy you some more flowers." I was saying foolish things then. But long story short, so I'm there at her house all day long. She sent one of her neighbors down to the village where the phone was to call the Americans to come get me. They didn't for 5 or 6 hours. Finally, they showed up. So I'm out there getting in the Jeep, and one of the MPs that had come to get me said, "Where's your parachute, Lieutenant?" That's how I gave it to her. "Well, you can't do that. That's government property, you know." And they went in and took it away from the poor lady. They did. Well, now you think about it, rationing that the British were going through at that time. You know, the island was completely surrounded with German submarines. Everything was rationed. And what could they do with, the diameter on that chute was 32 feet. So think of all the dresses or whatever they could make out of that, pure silk. You know. Anyway, they took it away from her. So the next day, and I'm proud of this, I borrowed a Jeep, went down to the PX, bought everything they had, candy, cosmetics, whatever they had. Went to the parachute shack and got 2 silk parachutes. Now, those are the days when we were just transitioning from silk to nylon. So I remember these guys climbing around on this big pile of chutes looking for silk. They finally found 2 silk ones for me. So we drove over to Bering St. Edmunds and presented the lady with the 2 silk parachutes and all this food, big bags. I had a couple of crew members with me. Well, that house of hers, Mrs. Childs was her name, and she was an older woman. She must have been 40, 42 maybe, something like that. It got to be a kind of a hangout for our crew. Her husband had been killed just recently over in Belgium in the British Army. Every time we went over there, of course, we'd take things. And so it was quite a nice friendship. As a matter of fact, years and years later, after I came back and went back to college and got married and everything else, we're still exchanging Christmas cards, this nice lady and I. So it was a kind of a warm touch in a cold killer war otherwise. If I may, one other short story. I was dating this beautiful, beautiful girl in London. Her name was Doris, and she was the prettiest girl I ever did date. In fact, she was the Gene Tierney type. Anybody here old enough to remember Gene Tierney, the movie star? Well, she was that type of beauty, truly a beauty. So anyway, one day I told her, Doris, you would look good in a black dress. And she would. I mean, she had the figure for it. A couple of weeks later, I'm back in London. I go out to Tottenham where she lived, and here she is in this black dress. And what a picture. What a pretty thing. Anyway, her mother grabbed me by the shoulder pads, ran me into a back room, closed. I'll never forget this. She screamed at me, "Lieutenant," she said. Doris went out and spent a year's worth of coupons on that black dress, ration coupons. It's so impractical. She can't wear it to work. Oh, Mom was, I thought I ought to marry the girl. Well, anyway, a couple more weeks go by. Doris and I are coming out of the movie house in London, Leicester Square. The movie had been about the British Navy. And of course, Doris is British, and she's very proud of her British Navy, and she starts bragging it up. Well, I had kind of had it, but I had flown a few combat missions, and I think I was probably a little bit nervous at that point. But, well, I got to back up for just a second, because this story is about British arrogance. The newspapers, headlines, Monty advances 2,000 yards, column after column about Monty baby, Way down at the bottom, or maybe on the next page or something, it would say the Americans advanced 28 miles, Or, an even better example, in the movie house one time in Ipswich, near our air base. In fact, Ipswich was totally surrounded by American air bases. They do the newsreels. You remember Movie Tone News? Well, the British version of that was called Galmont British News, bringing the truth to the free peoples of the earth. Anyway, they show these British airplanes flying around at night. This voice says that British bombed Cologne. And here's all these searchlights, so forth, and these British airplanes flying around, taking pictures of each other, the fires down there in the city. Well, we had been there the day before. We set those fires. The 8th Air Force did. So, guys started clapping. They started running up and down the aisles. They're up on the stage. I was among them. They cut off the newsreel right in the middle and started the movie, which was an American movie. Okay. Anyway, back to Doris. So we come out of this movie about the British Navy, and she starts bragging up the British Navy. And as I said, I'd kind of had it up to here by then. So I said, Doris, you wouldn't have a Navy if we didn't give it to you. Well, anyway, that was the end of Doris, the black dress and all. Boy, I tell you, I didn't make it into the diplomatic corps. Jesuit trained, by the way, Loyola man. Okay. If I may, I'd like to just tell quickly a typical combat mission, if I may. I flew 31 of them. They were all in Germany. Some of them were very deep penetration, particularly the later ones, in the first part of 1945. I was there the second half of 44 and the first 3 months of 45. That's the span of my 31 missions. Typical mission was 10 to 12 hours long. If it was in the Rhine Valley, like Cologne or Essen or any of those cities, Frankfurt, it would be like a 10 and a quarter hour mission. If it was in the central part of Germany, Nuremberg, Munich, Berlin, Hanover, Hamm, it would be 11 and a quarter. And later on, toward the end, when it was faraway places like Dresden, it was approaching 12 hours. And that was the absolute limit to the endurance of a B-17. Okay, if you've seen the movie 12 O'Clock High, you remember this big beer stein that they used. They'd put it up on the mantle to notify everybody in the officers' club that there was a mission tomorrow morning, go home and quit drinking. And, okay, in our group, it was a board, and written on it or printed on it, it said, "There is a giant on the beach." I don't know where that comes from, maybe part of a poem or something. There is a giant on the beach. So we'd be in the officers' club, and the phone would ring, and the corporal, the bartender, would answer the phone, and he'd hang it up, he'd pick up this board, he'd go over and he'd put it on the mantle. That meant the bar's closed, go home and get some sleep, you'll be waking up early in the morning. Okay, so that's the way we did it in our group. Well, the next voice you hear is some guy shaking you. He says, Lieutenant Clarke, it's 4:45, briefing at 5:45. So you'd quickly put on your clothes, go out and get on these trucks. Now, the trucks didn't stop for you. They kept moving slowly, big 6-bys. So you had to kind of run and climb on them real fast as they're moving along. The first stop was at Chow Hall. Now that was a fun thing. The food was, it makes you wish you were a civilian again. I was just thinking about this cereal, for example, powdered milk. You put the cereal in your bowl, and you ladle out this great big thing full of milk. You ladle out and pour it on your cereal. Well, the milk would stay on top, and the water would go on down through. So, no kidding. And once in a while, we'd have eggs, powdered eggs, with the consistency of sandpaper. Anyway, it was not a gourmet thing. Okay, so after eating is over, you run out and grab one of these ever-moving trucks, and the next stop would be the briefing block. Now that was a building made out of cement blocks, a one-story thing, square. Of course, the only people allowed in there were combat crews and briefing officers. Well, the pilots sat next to the center aisle. Next to them was the co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flying crew chief, gunners, in that order, on both sides of the aisle. Now there are 39 crews on a mission, 39 in a group, 3 squadrons of 13 each. Okay. So again, if you've seen 12 O'Clock High, you've seen all this, and that's exactly the way it was done. That movie is so authentic. It is not Hollywood. And if you haven't seen it or haven't seen it recently, do it again. Okay. We'd get a briefing by the weather officer. We'd get a short speech by the chaplain. And then finally, the briefing officer would stand up there. Now, on the back wall is a map, a huge map, probably 12 by 15 or something, big map of Europe with England over in the corner, covered with a curtain. The briefing officer standing up there, and doggone it, he'd say it every time, "Today, unfortunately, men, your target is." And then this clown back there with the drawstring on the curtain would yank, and the thing would hum, and everybody in the room would go, oh. That was the first time we knew where we were going that day. Then we'd get the specifics. Now, the way they indicated it was with push pins on the map, and then yarn stretching from push pin to push pin. It showed, where our fighter escort would join us. It showed, of course, the target and the initial point leading to the target, the flak fields that we would go around or sometimes go through. So anyway, again, that was our first knowledge of where we were going to be that day. Then our next stop, of course, is the airplane. And once you've been briefed, you're not allowed to go anywhere else except directly to your airplane. By the way, they briefed an extra crew every time, just in case somebody didn't make it off the ground or whatever. They had this standby crew. I had that mission one time, spent the whole day playing gin rummy because we couldn't leave the briefing block because we knew where the mission was going. We were not allowed to leave there until the guys came home. Okay, so now you're out in your airplane. Here comes your gunners. Now, they were allowed to bring as much ammunition as they wanted to. The only one that could countermand them was the first pilot. And some of those guys, so help me, they looked like Pancho Villa. They had ammunition strung up. I don't know how they could carry it all. We had to send them back sometime because they're just ridiculous how much. Now remember, a 50 caliber in those days fired at 760 rounds a minute. That's a lot of ammunition. So all the guy could carry was probably a minute and a half's worth of ammunition. You know, that's why Gregory Peck kept shouting at him, short burst, don't waste your, okay. Okay, so all the communication now is done by flares. We were not allowed to talk on our radios. In fact, just to make sure, they had safety wired the toggle switches on our transmitter. So a flare would shoot off from the tower, and that meant start engines, a certain color flare. Then there'd be another flare, different color, and that meant start taxiing. And finally another flare, different color, first airplane take off. And from then on, it was like every 20 seconds, the next one would take off, and so forth. And head right for that buncher that I mentioned a minute ago. I mentioned on the first mission we flew through this burning thing at the end of the runway. That, again, we didn't know what it was, and I guess I'm glad. I was scared enough as it was. We would hit our bombing altitude at the same time that we would hit enemy lines. So before, I got there right after D-Day, okay. So the American troops were into France somewhat, so there was a front line, and it was moving. We timed our climb. Now, B-17 fully loaded climbed at 150 feet a minute, which is, my gosh, present-day airplanes go straight up, including the commercial airliners. But we climbed at 150 feet a minute, which is not very fast. Okay, so we would time it so that we would hit our bombing altitude at the same time we hit the front lines. That was also the interception point where our fighter escort would join us. Now, they flew above us, and they did giant S-turns above us because we're tooling along at 150, 155 knots. and their airspeed is 300 or 325 or whatever, the P-47s, P-38s, and then later on the P-51s. But to keep up their airspeed, in case they're needed, in case the Germans show up, okay. A few minutes before we would get to the actual target, we would hit a point called the initial point, the IP. At that point, we would spread the formation so we'd all be on the same altitude in a square pattern, 13 airplanes. Open our bomb bay doors and go over the target. Now, you know about the Norden bomb site, which was supposed to be secret in those days. Of course, the Germans had a few of them because our airplanes landed there, not because they wanted to. But anyway, that bomb site was hooked into our automatic pilot. And so for the last 3 or 4 minutes of that, from the initial point to the target, the bombardier was actually steering the airplane through the automatic pilot with his Norden bomb sight. And we're sitting there like this, we don't have any guns to fire or anything else. Well, now, of course, we're sitting ducks for the anti-aircraft fire from down below. We're up at 29,000 feet. It took the 88 millimeters about 22 seconds to get up to that altitude. If we could make any diversion at all, they couldn't anticipate us. But here we are for 8 or 9 minutes, straight and level, couldn't change altitude, direction, speed, anything. So it was a field day for the anti-aircraft fire, and here they come. Now, our only defense against that anti-aircraft fire at that point in time was what we called chaff. And maybe you've heard about chaff, but it was shredded metal foil that the radio operator would throw out a chute from his radio room halfway back through the airplane. That stuff would float down. The enemy radar down there, steering their guns, would fix in on that floating metal, and we'd see a whole bunch of flak down below us. Thank heaven it was down there. Of course, a lot of it came up to us also. Okay, so now we finally get to the target, and finally the anti-aircraft fire stops, because once we drop our bombs, the lead plane drops his nose and takes a turn one way or the other. And we're trying to catch him because, again, our formation's all spread out. We close our bomb bays, firewall the throttles, RPM control first and then throttles. You've played Whipcracker. You know if you're out there on the end somewhere, you got to go 4 times as fast. And boy, I tell you, it was a field day then for the German fighters, the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs. What they had been doing ever since we got in from the IP on to the target, they're looming over there 2,000 or 3,000 feet above us and just lurking, waiting for us. But they didn't want to be down in among the flak, their own anti-aircraft fire, so they're lurking over there. But as soon as we drop our bombs and change our direction and our altitude, anti-aircraft fire is no longer effective. Here come the fighters. Now, again, we're spread all over the sky. We're trying to catch up. We're closing our bomb bay doors. We're doing everything we can to make it get formation again for mutual protection. So now they're in among us, the fighters. We reform, we head home, always a different way than the way we came. So again, the enemy fighters couldn't anticipate us, and so forth. As I said earlier, a typical mission like that was between 10 and 11 hours. And imagine 10 or 11 hours of wearing an oxygen mask. You didn't want to have any stubble beard, believe me, because if you did, you'd end up with a face full of pimples. I mean, after all those hours of that darn thing. Well, that's the way a mission was supposed to happen. And it was amazing how often it did happen that way. But of course, there were aberrations that you would expect, things going wrong.
That's,
We had some losses on our crew, and so forth. But I'd like to leave that out.
this is strictly up to you. because
Okay.
It's a comfort zone, and you're giving us marvelous material here, and we appreciate that.
I started out as a co-pilot. I ended up as pilot. Later on, I was a pilot on a B-29, but that was in the Pacific, of course. But I'm leaving out where people were getting hurt and getting killed. Okay. Are you turned on again?
Yeah, I'm back going. You were talking about that most of the time things did go the way they were supposed to, but there were times that there weren't.
Oh, yes, and that happens, and so therefore we had losses in our group. And you probably heard the story of the 100th group, the bloody 100th group that was jinxed. Their position in the bomber stream was right ahead of our group, and the German fighters used to go by us and go after them. They had a real vendetta on the 100th, the bloody 100th. One little story about the Germans real quickly. They were clean fighters. They were gentlemen. They were chivalrous. They were excellent flyers. They had great airplanes. That Focke-Wulf was really something. The Messerschmitt was, of course, an older design, but they kept updating it and updating it. It was just as fast as a Spitfire, almost as fast as a 51. Anyway, whereas the Germans were chivalrous and gentlemen and good sports and so forth, and you've heard those stories, they would not shoot at somebody in a parachute, for example. The Japanese did. But one of the tricks, the Germans were full of tricks. They were very clever about it. If an airplane was shot up real bad and couldn't make it back, or couldn't make it back to friendly lines or back to England, they could land in Switzerland. They would be interned, not imprisoned, but interned for the duration, and the Swiss got to keep the airplane. That was the deal that we had, the Allies had, with neutral Switzerland. And I saw airplanes divert. You know, they're running on two engines, barely hold their altitude. If they're both outboards and on opposite sides, they could hold altitude on two engines. But if they're not both high RPM and high manifold pressure, they couldn't do it even on two. Or they're smoking, or they got people on board wounded and dying and so forth. They could go to Switzerland. Well, now, of course, there were a lot of jokes about people defecting, you know, coming out to their airplane in the morning carrying their B-4 bags and so forth. I don't think that ever happened. I don't know that it did, but it was one of the stories going around. The Swiss would escort them down to an air base. Now, the Swiss flew Focke-Wulfs. They bought them from Germany. Well, you know, the Swiss flag is a white cross on a red background. So here comes a Focke-Wulf, you know, with a white cross, red background, and here's this airplane surrendering. The way to surrender was to lower your wheels, lower your flaps, leave the formation, and then here comes a Swiss airplane to lead you down to a Swiss air base. Well, the Germans were not stupid. They caught onto this one real quickly. They owned some Focke-Wulfs too. So they painted theirs with a red cross on a white background. So here's an airplane smoking, wounded people on board, they're surrounded by mountains, they're gradually losing altitude. And here comes a Focke-Wulf with a cross. They follow him down to Germany. I mean, here's the guy the pilot, in a desperate situation. And red on white, white on red, don't bother me with details, that kind of a thing. That happened a few times. But I just use that as an illustration of some of the kinds of clevernesses that the Germans used. Okay. I guess I'm out of gas, unless you have a question, Phil.
We do have some questions.
Mhm.
But what was the bigger danger? Was it the fighters or the flak?
Oh, that's a tough one. It is. I saw airplanes go down for both of them. I actually remember reaching down and picking up a piece of spent flak that was on the deck of my B-17. It was still hot, a piece of metal. We seldom came home without holes in our airplane. On the other hand, the 20 millimeters was scary because you could see them. The Germans used headlight tracers sometimes. Now, you think of a tracer bullet, usually you think it's a tail light, so you can see where they're going. But the Germans, for psychological warfare reasons, had every once in a while, one of those 20 millimeters would be a headlight tracer, and you'd see it coming. That was the scariest thing in the world. I swear, sitting there, especially as a co-pilot, because you don't have anything to do. The other guy's flying the airplane, everybody else has got a gun to shoot or something, and there you sit. And here comes these 20 millimeters. Every one of them seemed to go right by my ears. So they were scary too. I don't know which one I feared the most. On the subject of fear, I don't remember feeling real fear, nervousness, sometimes a little bit of apprehension. My main concern was not wanting to screw up. I screwed up a couple of times that I'll admit to. Once in a while, we'd be assigned to fly the high element. Now, the lead airplane had 2 wingmen and other elements with their wingmen and so forth. Then there was a high element, 3 airplanes, flying along here. Now, to fly there, you had to look down at the lead plane and fly formation on him. Well, Jones and I traded off about every 20 minutes flying because it's tough. B-17s were not power steering, or the rudders were not. No, they were not hydraulic assist. The B-29s were. You could fly those with a fingertip, but not a B-17. You had to fly them. Anyway, so after about 20 minutes of this, looking down there flying, you'd cross over. Your wingman, of course, would go with you. You'd cross over, and now the co-pilot is looking down and flying. So that's what we did for 9 hours, 10 hours, 11 hours. We'd do that back and forth. Once on a crossover, right in the middle of the crossover, when we're blind, now I can't see the lead down there, he starts a turn. And I can't see him. I just saw him begin the turn. And so I started climbing too. He was climbing, turning. And I couldn't see him, and I couldn't see him. And I got to the point where I almost stalled out that B-17. High altitude, they stall at a fairly high airspeed. So more power quickly and so forth. And got it back all right again. We lived through that screw up on my part. Of course, I told my version of it. One other time, I got the manifold pressure a little bit too high for the RPMs. Now, if you do that on an air-cooled engine, you'll blow the pistons right out of the cylinders. You don't want to do that. You have to keep your RPMs ahead of your manifold. But I got it a little bit too high. That was the only time that Jones ever chastised me, and that only lasted for about 2 seconds, because I was better than that. I was very good. before I ever got into a B-17, I was an excellent truck driver on my dad's beer trucks when I was a 16-year-old. So if I could handle a beer truck, I could handle a B-17. Okay. One thing that may be interesting to you, stop me if you want, is just a couple more stories about our crew members, and then we'll let it go at that. Jones was the world's leading practical joker. Now, we got a ration of cigarettes, 5 packs a week. He didn't smoke. I did at that time. So he'd sell me his 5. So now I have a whole carton. And of course, the British girls just loved those cigarettes, so it came in handy. So I come back from the shower one time, which is a couple of blocks away, and walk into the barracks. Here Jones had taken all 10 packages of my Philip Morris's and made little log cabins all over. I mean, on the foot lockers, on the beds, I mean, little log cabins of cigarettes. You know, opened up all the packages and so on. He thought that was hilarious. Now he was starting to get a little bit combat weary, I think, too. We all were in those days. One time we walked into the Red Cross in Ipswich, rented a couple of rooms for the night. It cost 2 shillings, 40 cents. We go in there, we take these blankets off of the bed, Red Cross blankets. They were white wool, thick, pure wool, big Red Cross in the middle, of course. Folded them long ways, took off our coats, wrapped them around each other, put our coats back on and walked out. We had these beautiful white blankets for the duration of the war. I mean, and when we left, we sold them to a crew coming in. But that was, again, one of his ideas. Last one. We go into a store in Ipswich and buy a radio, a big console radio. The thing stood that high. You remember those old radios. And we paid, I think it was 12 pounds for the thing. It would be $48. Yeah. A pound at that time was $4.03.50, and they paid us in pounds, of course. But anyway, I think we paid 12 pounds. So he got the guy to give him a receipt that said 16 pounds. So then we get back to our Quonset hut. Now here we are. The pilot is in the front corners on either side. The co-pilot, navigator, bombardier. So the 4 officers of one crew on that side of the Quonset. Over there they called them Nissen huts, but they were the same as Quonsets. So 2 crews. So we come back, he's got this receipt that says 16 pounds. So then he sells shares to everybody in the Quonset hut. Of course, he had the darn thing planted by his bed. I mean, but anyway, he sold shares in this radio to everybody in the room. I got my side of the room. He got. So then the other crew proceeded to get itself shot down. So we sold that half of the radio again. So then one day we get to come home, so we sell our half. We made a fortune on that radio. Yeah, that was Jones, a clown. I'd be flying along. Sometimes the windshield would frost up, real bad. And boy, in flying formation, you got to concentrate every second. You know, you keep your relative position, and your hands are on the throttles, of course. Constantly, and you're looking out the window. Well, the windows would frost up. Well, the way we unfrosted it, we'd take off our heated gloves. Well, we wore heated suits. They were like electric blankets, you know, with the wires in them, including the gloves. They had terminals that snapped onto the jacket, so heated gloves as well. We'd take off a heated glove, turn it inside out, and hold it up against the window and burn a hole in the frost on the window so that we could see our lead airplane. Well, Jones would sit over there and he'd take the checklist like this to cover up the hole in the and I can't see. And I'm trying, and that airplane is 10 feet from it. You know, he thought that was funnier. Oh, Jesus. Oh, I'm sorry. Hey, thank you for letting me reminisce a little bit. I've really enjoyed this.
That's okay. We do have a couple other questions we want to ask you
All right.
specifically here. Where were you at the end of the war?
My last mission was Hamburg. Then we got on the QE1, Queen Elizabeth, in Glasgow, and came home. I was on the high seas in the QE1 when the British captain announced that President Roosevelt had just died. I was home. I was home. We landed in New York and rode the train then out to California where my family lived, and I had a couple of weeks of leave. And that's when the war ended in April. I was sent to March Field there and was assigned the job of checking out these guys who had been captured by the Japanese pilots, hadn't flown in 3 or 4 years, and I was given the job of checking them out again. And you don't forget how to fly, but these guys were all nervous wrecks. They were rich, of course, because their pay had accumulated, and they had been promoted all over the place. They all outranked the heck out of me. So I had enough of that. They were landing long, they were landing short, it was scary. So I ran down to the other end of the field at Marshfield and volunteered into a B-29 outfit. So I ended up over in the Pacific then.
How long were you over there?
A year. I got there just as the war ended. So I stayed and flew transport airplanes all over the Pacific. I formed a football team over there, and of course I could get an airplane, and my job was assistant operations officer. I was a captain then. So I could get on the teletype machines and schedule football games in Guam or Iwo or all over the Philippines, Japan. So we had some interesting football games all over the Pacific. It was great. People were climbing over each other to get on that team because we were getting off the rock, which is what they called Okinawa at the time, to get to Japan or the Philippines or other places. So it was an interesting time in my life. I stayed in on purpose because I like to fly, and I was trying to get a permanent commission. I didn't get it because they required 2 years of college at that time. I only had 1. So, okay, long answer to your short question.
I had a couple of things. You had mentioned that you were back at home, at least for VE Day. Do you remember what the situation was like at home? Was it a celebration? Was it just relief that the war was over? Do you remember what the reaction was?
You know, I truly don't remember any wild parties or anything. I do on VJ Day. I was in Wichita, Kansas, and that was fun. We were on a B-29 training mission, and we heard on the radio that it dropped the bomb on Nagasaki and the Japs were quitting. So this instructor pilot said, you don't want to go back to Great Bend, Kansas and celebrate the ending of the war. No, we don't. Well, don't go back there. Let's go somewhere else. So one of the engineers that was on board said, I think we can fake it. So we landed in Wichita. He climbed out on the wing and came back and he says, I defy you to start number 3. We didn't even try. We just all disappeared for 3 or 4 days. Finally, we got back together again. He climbed out on the wing. What he had done was put a nail through the harness ring. Now, you understand the wiring on a radial engine, it's in bundles. There's so many wires to all those engines, And so he put a nail through him, and it shorted out 4 or 5 cylinders. The thing wouldn't start. So as soon as we get back from 3 or 4 days of raising hell, Wichita is a pretty dead place normally, but not during the VJ days. But anyway, he climbs out on the wing again, and within 30 seconds, we're ready to take off. In the meantime, the people back at the air base had tried to fix it, and they couldn't. They couldn't find that nail. They didn't. Oh well. Diversion. I'm sorry.
That's great.
Fine. I got a couple of other things. I'm sure you have one or two, because things come up as you talk, and we end up relating to the other interviews that we've had and things like that. But you talked about when you get into England, and they cleared out your barracks from the crew that had been shot down before.
Mm-hmm.
Did the other crews have anything to do with you guys as replacements coming in, or did they just kind of ignore you?
Oh no, we were good friends. We were good friends. The other crew that was still there when we moved in, their first pilot was a minister, a religious minister. I forget the denomination, but a very devout man. He knelt down every night by his bunk. Our bombardier joined him once in a while. I'm a Catholic boy, so I said my own prayers, but. No, they were very good friends all the way through. They never knew that we cheated them on that radio. But,
The reason I bring this up is because we've had guys that, especially from the early missions, the guys that were in 43 or so, the very few that had made it through 20, 30 missions or so, saying that the replacements were coming through so quickly they didn't even want to get to know them. And I didn't know if that was your experience or not.
no, I never felt that. You got to remember, we were 19 years old, 20 years old. We were a bunch of college kids. We were having a blast. This is a huge adventure. Yeah, we were exposed to enemy fire for 6 or 7 hours every 3 days for a period of 6 months. But it came and went in a hurry. I had a English girlfriend for a while who was in the Royal Navy, Women's Royal Navy, WRN. Her job, she had a boat. Her job was to rescue aviators out on the channel there, you know. I went out with her one time as a passenger. She had a crew of 3 other girls. One time, Jean invited me to her base. It was an all-women base because they were going to have a parade. So I said, sure, why not? So it was up near Norwich, if you're familiar with the geography in England. So I go up there, and I'm standing there in front of the reviewing stand, you know, second lieutenant, pinks and greens. Up on the reviewing stand are all these British officers, women, with stripes all over the place, you know. One of them came up to me, tapped me on the shoulder and said, Lieutenant, would you like to come up on the reviewing stand? Wow. Okay. So I'm up there, you know, and they go marching by. Jean, of course, was in the parade. They weren't very good. I mean, their lines were not very good. But anyway, when the thing was over, Jean and I get back together again. We go over to their version of a PX. I forget what they called it. And we have a Coke and so forth. And so now it's time for me to leave. We go out to the front gate, and it's locked up. And there's nobody there. So we go over to the administration building, and there's some people in there, but no ranking people. And hey, they weren't authorized to open the gate. They were super careful for all this women base, you know, and so forth. So what do you do now? And I mean it. What do you do? I said, Second Lieutenant Clarke, you know. Well, to make this long story short, we go back to where she was, where she stayed. It was this huge Quonset hut. I mean, it was probably a hangar in real life, but they had it full of these triple bunks. Well, the front half of this huge building was all these wrens, three deep in wrens. The back half of the building was empty. So we carried one of those bunks back to the back wall, and that's where I spent the night. Now, like I said, we were a bunch of college boys. This is it sounds like a college boy story, but that's the kind of life we were living. We had football games against other crews, touch football it was supposed to be, except the enlisted people were having such a blast tackling the officers that okay. No. Jean, I introduced her to our ground crew chief. And so he would go out to the front gate and pick up Jean. And of course, she could get in. She was in uniform, British Navy. And bring her out to our hard stand. We would land from a mission, break up the formation and land, taxi up to our hard stand, slide the window open, the classic scene. Gregory Peck did it several times. Anyway, I'm looking out there. There's Jean sitting in the Jeep with the crew chief. Now, I think I'm probably the only guy in the 8th Air Force that had a girlfriend meet him at the end of a combat mission. Now, maybe Tyrone Power did, or Gregory Peck, but as far as I know, I'm the only one. But again, this is college boy stuff, To me, that's what I choose to remember about the war. I lost some very good people, very good friends, loved them very much. But they were quickly replaced with new ones, and life goes on. I don't dwell on that. I have never joined a veterans organization, never will. I get mail from the 34th Bomb Group, I throw it away. I don't write back to them. That's 60 years ago in my life. I'd rather live now. Okay. All right.
We were just wondering, since we're doing this for Buckley, which is a 60th anniversary salute to veterans, tying it in with 60th anniversary, how do you think people view what you did back then now? Do you find that people appreciate it, or do you think, what's your just reaction to that?
I am amazed. It cycles, what you're saying, public interest. And it depends a whole lot on the times. For example, during Vietnam, you didn't want to be a veteran. My son, all of a sudden, turns out to be very interested in what I did in the war. He wants to hear war stories. He got himself a leather jacket, put an 8th Air Force patch on it, out of respect for his dad. But that just happened in the last 4 or 5 years. But all that long span of years in between, no. And frankly, I didn't care if I was appreciated or not. So I guess I don't know how to answer it, right? I have all the respect in the world for our fighting men now, or for our fighting men anytime, including the ones I was with. But I don't know how to answer your question. Again, it cycles.
Are you happy that they're having events like this to recognize what your generation did and what your...
Well, I'm kind of amazed at the modern interest in something that went on 60 years ago. Because, as I said, it hasn't always been true. And the interest is fantastic. 2 years ago, I got an invitation to speak to a Saturday morning club out in Southern California at the Palos Verdes Country Club. And if you're familiar with Southern California, you know that Palos Verdes is a very exclusive area. Everybody in there owned their own airplanes, I think. Anyway, I'm the speaker because flew a B-17 wow. It's funny, they don't have that same interest in B-29s. and I don't know why. You'd think the public would. They were far superior, of course, airplane.
I think the problem was that B-29 came in later in the war, and it wasn't in as much of the action, especially early on.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have a B-29 pilot that we talked to out in Broomfield who flew off of Tinian and flew a lot of the missions up to Japan in 45. And we actually, one of the great pieces of luck we ever had is the last flying B-29 that the Confederate Air Force has flew in. We found out it was coming. We figured out when he was going into Front Range Airport, so we said, okay, let's catch the thing as it comes in, because that's the only time we know it's going to be on the air. We can always get ground shots and stuff like that, but let's catch it as it's flying in. So we go up, we show up out there, and they do fly by over the field, and I got some great shots of the plane coming in, landing, and they let us out in the tarmac as close as possible, and we didn't think anything of it at the time. It was September 10th, 2001.
I'll be
The
darned.
next day, it's September 11th. All the air traffic is shut down. All the security around airports is totally different from that point on. We did go back out there about 5 days later with our B-29 pilot and a B-24 navigator, because they had a B-24 flying at the same time. And we walked around, we mic'd them up, and we just followed them around with the camera here as these guys just kind of traded their reminiscences of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really fascinating, but we got our B-29 guy back in the pilot seat for the first time in about 55 years.
He actually sat in the pilot seat,
Hmm.
oh, the look in his face.
And so it was really, but yeah, it's a fascinating aircraft, but it just wasn't in the war as long.
Okay.
And I think when people think of, what happened, there were 3 years or so of B-17 missions, and it's what was there before. I think people were more aware of it back then.
You know, those B-29s did more damage in Japan than Nagasaki and Hiroshima added together. They did. They burned out Tokyo, Yokohama, and so forth.